Great. So I think that Kieran and Anna kind of got into the science of what's behind the SLO index. So that's our name. That's Yamana's name for the tool. I'm going to just give a really sort of high level blast of what the tool means for us, how we use it. Um, So this is where we operate in the three jurisdictions that we have rolled it out in are Jacobina in Bahia, Cerro Moro, which is in Patagonia, southern Argentina, and Minera Florida, which is in close to Santiago in Chile. We don't apply it at our El Peñon mine because it's in the Atacama Desert, and so these are the three questions that I am going to attempt to briefly answer. So why do we use this tool? What does it give us, and what's changed for us over the span of the last year or two since we've been applying it? So starting with the first question, why we use this tool. Interestingly enough, Kieran in his presentation referred to this report that Ernst & Young produces on an annual basis. And for the last 10 years, social license to operate has been either the number one or the top within the top five risks to mining. But I would ask you, as people who work in this space, do you know how you measure it? We say it's the most important thing, but do you know how to measure that risk? And do you feel like it is the most important risk at the operations that you work at? I think most of us would say no. That's certainly not the way it feels on the ground. So we say it's important, but we don't know how to measure it. And that was the big challenge that we faced. And past performance measures included things like how many stakeholder meetings you had, or the number of grievances that you registered, or your ability to close out the grievances, or the number of incidents, which was always a telling one. But again, I would ask the question: what does that tell you about the risk level or your performance as a company against that risk? Those tell you nothing. Now, the one exception to that may be the number of incidents, but for most operations, you you may go 5 years or 10 years or never have an incident. That doesn't mean that you don't have a risk. And as a former boss once said, and I really liked his quote: "The absence of bad is not an indicator of good." And that was kind of the premise with which we launched into this and decided we needed to do something. So back in 2015, we looked at all of the data across health and safety, environment, and community that we had, and we had a lot of data, but it didn't really seem to be telling us anything. So we kind of cleared the table of all of the data and said, let's take it down to scratch and answer these questions. What does the general manager of the mine site really want to know? Um, what does the CEO really want to know? What does the board really want to know? And the answers, for these all these groups of stakeholders were the same. And it's: do we have a social license? Is this social license at risk? And are things getting better or worse? Apologies, I'm just having some technical difficulties. Okay. Um, so that's what sent us in search um, of finding a tool that could answer these questions. And that's what led us to Kieran. It was actually a presentation that he gave in Chile. And at that time, it was CSIRO and now VoconiQ. So we made initial contact in 2015. We began planning and went through the whole budget approval and launched a pilot in 2017 in Brazil. Um, 2018 is when we expanded it to all operations, and last year was our first full year of, again, what we call the social license to operate index at all of our relevant um, operations. So that's kind of our journey. But what does the tool provide for us? What does it give us? Is the key question. And again, Anna and Kieran gave you the science. I'm going to kind of try to boil it down to the really simple stuff. So it gives us two things. It gives us actionable strategic data, and it gives us direct and very important visibility within the company. So what do I mean by actionable strategic data? It tells us, as Kieran got into, it gives you a really detailed snapshot of what's going on the ground. What do people think about you? And it also gives you data that you can act on, and that's the important thing. So what do people think? But also, how do we improve our numbers? The other critical thing, and I'll get into that in more detail, is that with with data, I mean, the whole opening, sequence, the introduction to this project, this presentation was about using science um, to measure social license, and that science, that data that this provides, gives you direct visibility within the company in a way that we haven't seen before. So uh, it takes it out of the realm of anecdotal, qualitative, and into the realm of science. And for those of you who do work in the mining industry, you know that we are all surrounded by engineers and finance people. These are people who live on data. So I can't speak enough to the importance of being able to bring data to the table in order to have a conversation, in order to measure that risk. So let's just talk for a minute about the actionable data. I'm going to again try to go through this fairly quickly so you can ask questions. But it gives you data on what are the issues in terms of the positive issues that people are concerned about. So that's things like jobs or business opportunities, but also the negative issues like noise, dust, vibrations, concerns about tailings, for example. It gives you actionable data about your engagement, the quality of engagement, what people think when they have interactions, and the quantity of engagement. Are you out there in the field? Are you having conversations frequently enough? Here's a couple of snapshots from a sort of a recently new and improved dashboard that Kieran and his team have developed. Again, I'm not going to go into the details of what the data is here, but there are a lot of key questions on this dashboard, and it gives you an opportunity to get a very quick snapshot about how each site is performing against some of the critical questions. Are we getting out into the community enough? What do people think when they do have an encounter with somebody from Yamana Gold? And what's really important, I think, is that all of the detail is really actionable for the community relations teams and the people who have the day-to-day responsibilities of managing this. But it rolls up into these two critical numbers of trust and acceptance. And Kieran or I or Anna can speak to what the difference is between trust and acceptance, because they are quite different, and it's important to understand the difference. But this is essentially that it's the answer to that problem that I posed at the beginning of my presentation, which is that we say social license is important, but we can't measure it. So it becomes very, very hard to have conversations with general managers or HR teams or procurement teams that we need to take action on an issue when you don't have the data to back it up. So I'm going to end off with just a few comments on what has changed for Yamana since we started using this. So I'm going to give an example of the actionable data piece. So pre-social license to operate index, here's a couple of points that speak to it's an example strategic plan, but these are sort of real issues. So the bullet points in the strategic annual plan for the community relations team were around hosting sort of a festival type day where we provide health clinics and other important health things to communities. We're providing financial support to local NGOs for economic development. We were providing education to schools, and we were going to update a stakeholder map. Now, I don't want to say any of these issues weren't important for the community, but none of them spoke to the critical issues that people said that they were concerned about, such as concern about tailings, concern about dust and vibrations, people wanting more jobs. The then post social licensing index sort of example strategic plan had things like this is within 1 year hosting community roundtables to jointly study mine related vibrations and co develop an action plan. So, speaking directly to one of the critical issues from the neighboring communities and doing it in a way, in an approach that was going to immediately generate trust. So we weren't just disappearing and coming back with data to say, well, it's not really an issue. We were bringing them into the process of studying the problem and co-creating an issue. So not just the change on the topical issue that we were topical issues that we were addressing, but how we approach those issues. Similarly, we at that site we initiated community participatory environmental monitoring and enhanced dialogue on tailings dam. So it was a complete, in my mind, a complete 90-degree or even 180-degree turn on the annual strategic plan. It was actually, I would argue, it was actually strategic as opposed to before, which we were just doing sort of development actions. And the last point I think I'll make here is, again, coming back to this slide on the visibility. You see I circled this last operation, the performance in Q2. These are actual results. And this is the first time we've seen a fairly dramatic drop in trust. Within sort of a week or so of everybody getting the results, I was on a phone call with our Senior Vice President of Health, Safety, and Sustainable Development, Senior Vice President of Operations, General Manager of that mine site, my colleague Ivan, who's the Regional Director of Health, Safety, and Sustainable Development, and the Community Relations team. So that kind of phone call has never really happened for me, unless there was an issue at one of the sites, unless there was a protest, unless there was a roadblock, unless there was some sort of critical, I don't want to say emergency, but some sort of significant issue. So having this data speaks to the power of being able to convene the really important people within an organization to ask really simple questions like, what's going on? And what's the action plan? How are we going to rectify this situation? And to be able to have the power is to be able to have that conversation before it gets bad, before something more significant like a roadblock happens at your operation. That's what this tool gives us, is that ability to, it's like the early warning sign to say, okay, something's not right here, we need to fix it. But then you have the data to dig into it and say, okay, well, let's take a look at at what's actually going on here. So I'm going to end it there and pass the mic over.